Good afternoon, evening, morning, or night. If God is sovereign, how can humans truly have free will? That's what I want to address in this video. This is one of the biggest theological and philosophical questions Christians have wrestled with for centuries. And the sovereignty of God and human free will is always going to be a topic that's debated and discussed. How much does God control? Do human beings actually make meaningful, really true, free choices? Or is everything already determined beforehand? Even down to that spaghetti you just dropped on your pants. So I've studied this topic off and on for years, but I really immersed myself in it when my daughter asked me a simple question. If God knew Cain would betray and kill Abel, why did he make him? If he knew Adam and Eve were going to fall from grace, why did he make them so that they could do that instead of putting them in a different situation where they couldn't? These are excellent questions. And many Christians will fumble around and say things like, well, God works in mysterious ways, or that's not for us to know. And those are what I call non-answers to avoid hard questions. Of course we don't know all these things. We're finite creatures. But I love hard questions because it makes me study, and studying brings me closer to God. So over the years, several major views have emerged on this topic. Calvinism teaches that God ultimately ordains all things according to his decree. Molinism teaches that God knows every possible choice of every possible world and chose which world to actually create. Some people have proposed what is called voluntary nescience, and this is the idea that God voluntarily chooses not to know certain future free actions committed by humans, and that's to preserve genuine human freedom and the sovereignty of God as well. Open theism teaches that future free choices are not fully settled, and therefore they're not exhaustively known in sort of like the classical sense of knowing. I don't fully subscribe to any of those views. I do believe each of them touches on part of the truth in some way. But the view that I hold is what I call the dynamic omniscience view. I know that sounds very technical and important, but it attempts to preserve the full sovereignty of God while maintaining genuine human freedom and responsibility. And this is the view that I presented to my daughter's questions at that time, but it was a very elementary way of doing it. But she understood it, she accepted it, and so perhaps it's of some good use. But the question is not is it of good use, but is it scripturally sound? Is it theologically grounded? What is dynamic omniscience? Well, omniscience simply means that God is all-knowing, and he knows all things completely and perfectly, and he knows all things past, present, future. It's dynamic in the fact that God knows not only fixed actualities, things that did happen or will happen, but possible and potential outcomes. He knows counterfactual outcomes, and all those pass simultaneously. That's just mind-boggling for us finite creatures. So the two questions arise: is if God knows everything, including the future, are our choices actually real and free and genuine? And if our choices are real, free, and genuine, does that somehow weaken God's sovereignty? I believe the answer to the first question is yes, and the answer to the second question is no. Yes, God is absolutely sovereign, and he's absolutely omniscient, but yet human beings possess real freedom and real responsibility. I firmly reject any view that turns God into some sort of movie director or participant. He is the creator and sustainer, and his free will that he gives you is part of his sovereignty, not in opposition to it. So to understand it, I think first we understand that God is not trapped inside time the way we are. He's the creator of time itself. And in Psalm 90, it says, 1,000 years in thy sight are but as yesterday when it is past. God's not looking into the future trying to predict outcome. He's not like a scientist studying, probability theory, and he stands outside of time entirely, and he sees all of history and the future before him. This is where I will use sort of a soft analogy. Now, I don't mean to soft in that it is a weak analogy, but that the meaning, it's a concise version of a more complicated version of the analogy that I can't dive into in a 20-minute video. So we'll just say it's the elementary school version. It's a game analogy, and the game analogy sort of helps me explain the idea on a layman's level. Think of like an imaginary complex game designed. God created the game, he created the rules, the structure, the consequences, the rewards, every possible path within the system. He knows every possible move, every possible decision, every consequence, every ripple effect, everything. He knows every outcome because he designed it. And yet the player, we'll say, genuinely chooses to move. We genuinely choose what move we make. God's omniscience comes from being the author of reality, not because he forces every individual choice, like a programmer controlling a robot, okay, or a movie director directing an actor. And this is what philosophers and theologians sometimes call counterfactuals. You heard me mention that earlier. A counterfactual is simply the knowledge that of what would happen in a circumstance if the circumstances were different. In other words, God knows not only what will happen, he also knows what could have happened and what would have happened under different conditions. So he knows how every person would freely respond in every possible situation, because he is the author of reality. Jesus even hinted this sort of in Matthew 11 when he said Tyre and Sidon would have repented if they had seen the miracles done. And I think also you could use in 1 Samuel where David asked God whether Saul will come to Keilah or whether the men of the city will hand him over. And God tells David what would happen. David leaves, and the event never actually occurs. So God knew not only the actual events, but the potential outcome. So that means God's knowledge is not limited to one fixed line of history or the future. He knows every possible branch, every possible reaction, every possible consequence within the reality he created. Okay? So the important distinction is this. Foreknowledge, okay, is not causation. Just because God knows something will happen does not mean he caused it to happen. I know the Calvinists will disagree there, but if I watch a replay of a football game and I know the quarterback throws an interception in the second quarter, my knowledge of this event does not cause the interception. In a greater way, greater sphere, God sees all of time at once. He knows the choices we freely make because all the moments are eternally present before his eyes. And the reason the Bible always speaks like human choices are meaningful is because that they are. They are meaningful. Joshua chapter 24 verse 15 says, "Choose you this day whom you will serve." So Jesus himself even wept. You know, he had an emotional reaction to something when he was here, Lazarus. So, you know, we've got to look at Scripture presents real invitation. It presents real accountability for human beings. Human freedom never threatens the sovereignty of God. And this is where I differ from the idea that God, you know, meticulously micromanages every action, you know, in order to remain sovereign. He doesn't have to do that. God is so infinitely wise and powerful that he can allow real human choices and still bring all the choices that were made under his will exactly where he intends it to be. People sometimes speak of God's perfect will and God's permissive will. I've even spoken like that. And I understand those terms, but ultimately there is really only God's will. And human beings can rebel, we can disobey, we can sin, and none of those choices are outside of God's purpose, his final purpose. God does use human decisions and he weaves them into his plan. A good example of that is Joseph, the coat of many colors Joseph. His brothers freely chose to betray him, and God did not force them to do that. Joseph says later that, you know, you thought evil against me, but God meant it for the good. So the evil that happened was weaved into God's plan. The outcome belongs to God. And that's dynamic omniscience. God allows freedom, and yet his sovereignty is complete. That he can even use rebellion itself to move toward his ultimate purpose. So, to me, it also explains how prophecy can exist alongside freedom. God does not lose his ability to intervene, okay? So just because you have free will, God also has free will. And he can intervene. The resurrection was not uncertain. You know, Jesus was delivered, and that was God's plan. And the choices that Judas made were part of that. So we have to look at it like God allowing human freedom within his plan. And I don't subscribe to open theism because I don't believe God is discovering the future as it unfolds. I think that's ridiculous. He's God. He's the Alpha. He's the Omega. He's the beginning and the end. He already knows the final results of what's going to happen. There's no limitation of God's knowledge. There's only the limitation of our understanding of how he reacts with us. So one objection could be, if humans are truly free, then God cannot be fully sovereign. I reject that entirely. A truly sovereign God can permit meaningful freedom and still guarantee his final purpose. I think this is all over Scripture. You know, Proverbs says there are many devices in man's heart, but nevertheless the counsel of God, that shall stand. You know, some people worry that this makes evil part of God's moral character. You know, evil is decreed by God. But I believe Scripture rejects that. You know, God cannot be tempted with evil, neither he tempteth any man, it says in James. God permits evil, he's not the author of it. He's so sovereign, he can redeem and he can redirect what was meant for evil toward his ultimate purpose. And I think Joseph, coat of many colors guy, is a perfect example of that. I believe this view also strengthens prayer, because prayer matters to God. He genuinely works through prayer. Again, you go back to the book of James, and it says, the effectual fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much. That's not a lie. That's not God saying, oh, I am doing all these things through you, but you don't genuinely have free will. No, he's accomplishing things through prayer, and it's genuine prayer. At the end of the day, I know there's a mystery because we're finite creatures and we're just attempting to understand an infinite God. But I truly believe that Scripture teaches 4 truths at the same time. God is sovereign. God is all-knowing and all-powerful. Human choices are free and they are real. And human beings are morally responsible for their actions. So this view, I guess, is sort of my attempt to hold the truths together, that God is sovereign and humans do have free will. And I don't think one cancels out the other. So my conclusion is this, to sum it all up. God created the game. God knows the game. God sustains the game. And he knows the outcome. He knows every actual possibility. He knows every actual potentiality of what could happen under any circumstance. And within that reality, human beings make genuine free choices. And they are held fully accountable for those choices. God's knowledge does not destroy freedom. And human freedom does not weaken the sovereignty of God. God will accomplish his will in all things, even as Acts 2:23 says, by the hands of lawless men. I think it makes it clear that God's wisdom and his power and his sovereignty can allow real freedom and bring all these things to the final restoration that he has already declared from the beginning. So I hope that clears some things up. That's my view on the compatibility of the sovereignty of God and human free will coming together. I hope you enjoyed this video. I will attempt to answer other questions, or maybe I can get to a couple of questions in the next 2 videos. Some of these questions are getting pretty deep, but leave your comments and your questions for me until next time, and we'll try to get around to answering all these questions. And I hope that this explanation was understandable, and if not, send me your questions and we'll try to break it down a little bit more. But until next time, good day and God bless you all.